If you like what you see here, please hit the subscribe button below to be the first to know about new videos and free premium content.
Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel, and as promised we're now going to talk about training. Actually, we're going to talk about training and recovery for the Great World Race and marathon and ultra training in general. Actually, when you think about what's required to train for a long distance event, you've also got to consider the fact you've got to recover and absorb that training too. So I thought we'd put both topics together, and on that subject, a different video, we're going to look at things like what's in my amazing pill case here, the supplements required for sort of training, recovery and immune system health. We're going to look at all that and what might be in these special little containers too. That'll be either later in this one or another video. So training, let's start with what's that going to cover. So the basics, right? We've got to look at run training, strength and core conditioning, mobility, flexibility, biomechanics. So the point is, even though this is a long distance event, we're going to focus on creating complete athletes. So as you might know if you've read any of my work or seen any of my videos before, to me being a complete athlete is really, really important no matter what distance you're racing. So what is a complete athlete? Well, it's somebody who has all the elements of their fitness in place so that they can compete at any distance they want. So when you're thinking about running, you've got to have great biomechanics to be able to run fast. And if you can run fast, you've also got speed, which helps build your VO2 max and your power and all these other things. Those are still important for people who are going to run for a long time at slower paces. I want to see complete athletes who have a great aerobic base, they have strength, great speed, good threshold development, all the areas that take up and make up all of their physiology. That's what we want to make sure is completely optimized for any race, including the Great World Race. So let's talk about periodization. Periodization is the concept of putting all the building blocks of training in the correct order so that you can peak when you want to peak, and it's what makes an athlete complete. So we start off by building a great aerobic base, and from there we add on some strength elements, requiring things like hills, and then we add on some threshold developments, ultimately peaking with VO2 work and speed, and even rep work to make the body be able to move very, very fast with power. So the art of periodization is super important, and I should state that Michelle, coming into this event, wasn't particularly a runner. She'd run a marathon before, but she wouldn't class herself as a runner. She's an athlete, but running wasn't necessarily her thing. So we kind of had to start from the beginning with her, literally treat her as a new runner. So she wasn't already running 30 miles a week. She was coming to this sort of starting to run a little bit, being very fit, but not really in run training. So I looked at this project with her in sort of two phases. Number one, make her into a marathon runner. And then number two, take that fitness and extend it so we could do this Great World Race, 7 marathons in 7 days. So the first thing was, how does she become a marathon runner? So to become a marathon runner, we've got to start at the beginning, which is, where are you? So that means coming into the lab. So we brought her into my lab, we did VO2 testing on her to really do fat max testing, which is finding out the maximum amount of fat burnt at different training intensities, so we can really look at what was going on there, because fat is the number one fuel source, right? We've got to make someone really fat efficient so they're sparing carbohydrates so they can really have great endurance. So we do the VO2 stroke fat max test, and then we also just obviously doing the lactate test to set up the correct training zones and work out how she's built and where her zone 2 is, so she can do all that proper base training correctly, where her threshold was, and really what her whole physiology was like, strengths and weaknesses. So from those two tests put together, we could really start out with a base training program, knowing where she is and how to grow from there. The point from the lab testing was to really find out what she needed. And that's the point about anybody I coach, right? It doesn't matter what they're doing, what races they're doing. We need to know their starting point, how they're physically built, so that all the training and all the planning makes specific sense for that individual. So that's what we did. And we found out that she actually had a decent aerobic base, but she wasn't really much of a fat burner. So I had to get involved and really start to shape her nutrition program, her fueling before she was running, really to carefully control the training intensity using heart rate so that she would be training in the right zones, building a proper aerobic fat burning base. That was the start of the whole thing. And of course, that's the basis of being a great marathon runner or a great ultra runner. You've got to have that fat burning base. The other thing to consider with every athlete is how much volume can they handle. So the Great World Race, of course, 7 marathons, 7 days, you've got to run a lot. So volume of training matters, but only so much as you can handle and absorb without getting broken down and injured. it's always better to be slightly undertrained than 1% overtrained. And so that was the delicate balance throughout this whole process, which is getting Michelle especially to be able to run more and more and more, and doing it in a way where she could recover, absorb it, and also then go again. Now, the other factor with her is she's a traveler anyway, and she's working all the time, and heavy workload. So what we had to do is build training into an already busy traveling life. So what we decided to do was make sure that the travel was considered helpful to the training rather than a hindrance. I mean, on the Great World Race, we're traveling in a jet across the world every single day. So it's basically run, then jump on a jet and travel. So let's use that in her training specifically for her and work out how training and travel work together. So it was a great opportunity to actually learn by having those two combined. The other thing to remember was, and I think this is a tip for every athlete, is to focus on yourself and not what anyone else is doing. Athletes who work with me, we have a very simple process, right? We get in the lab and we test, and we then know that the body has spoken and that training is specific to you. So then we focus on you doing the right training for you. And we avoid the external stimulus, all the noise that comes from Instagram or Strava or following other people's training. We forget all of that and just focus on what this athlete needs and what they can do for themselves. If you do look at sort of the Strava feed or whatever for marathon runners and ultra runners, you can always think you're not doing enough, you should be doing more, everybody else is doing more than you, and it's not necessarily true, and it's probably not even that they're performing any better than you, they're just talking about doing more than you. So focus on doing your specific training, and that's what we really did here, which meant heart rate focus training based on data from the labs. That's what we really wanted to do. And then tracking that training daily, me looking at her training wherever she was in the world at the time, tracking it, looking at the data, checking was she doing it accurately and were there any gains. And what we saw over time specifically was in the same zones, she was getting faster and faster and faster, which is really, really important. We knew there was confidence that she was getting fitter. And the other thing you have to look at, of course, is the races you're going to be doing and the course specifics or the environment. So the Great World Race, we've got a freezing cold race in Antarctica, of course, and then it's going to be really hot everywhere else. So getting Michelle to train in the heat was a key thing. So she trained the middle of the day in the valley in Los Angeles, so it's hotter in the summer there, and she was able to train in heat, get used to that, as well as do the correct training stimulus, all controlled by the heart rate, like we said, so that she could improve her fitness, but also her heat adaptation. So when you're looking at your own specific races and the courses, yes, you have to plan to train for your course. If you're going to be running a hilly marathon or a hilly ultra or whatever it is, that's ultimately got to be part of what you're doing. Or if you're going to be running a fast flat race, that's the same. And your equipment choices will come into that too. For example, like I've got my shoes here. There's my normal shoes, plushy, comfortable shoes. And then of course the fast carbon plated things. Well, these things are going to be choices we make for the courses specifically as well. But the training has to make you good for every single course. And just because you've got a hilly event doesn't mean you have to train in the hills from the start. You have to prepare yourself to be fit enough to go into the hills, for example, and get benefit from those. So course specific, yes, but that's later. The first focus, and this is what we did with Michelle, is focus on becoming a marathon runner, a complete marathon runner first, and then getting specific from that point into what is this exact event we're doing, what are the requirements for that event, and then focusing there. And I would say this is the biggest tip for anybody. Number one, become a complete athlete and then focus on getting ready for your race. So if you're an Ironman athlete, you don't think about training for Ironman from the start, you think about becoming this complete triathlete who could race every distance. And then you start an Ironman specific training block where you build to do an Ironman. Or from being a complete athlete, you focus on then going into doing a marathon or an ultra or a 5K or a 10K, whatever it is that you want to become great at, do it from being a complete athlete first. Now, the other thing to consider, as I said, is the courses, and most of these courses for this Great World Race are looped courses. They're sort of 10 times 4K loops or something like that, 8 times 5K. Really helpful, actually, I think that is from a perspective of fueling and mentally, because you're only running small distances. You're never running a marathon, if you think about it. You're not running 26.2 miles or 42K. You're running 10 loops. So you're just counting them off. Much simpler. I think that's much simpler anyway, mentally. So even though it's flat, though, the courses, we still used hill training quite a lot, of course, because the benefits of hill training are creating great biomechanics and great strength. So again, when it comes to becoming a complete athlete, we're always changing the stimulus through training blocks, typically 6-week training blocks, 2 weeks build, 1 week of active recovery, where we're increasing volume and then increasing intensity as we go through as well. So when we're looking at volume of training, because the specifics are of course volume, frequency and intensity basically, right? Those are the things we can change. If you're doing 7 marathons in 7 days, you've got to be able to run 7 days in a row. Pretty basic stuff, right? But you've got to build to that. You can't just jump in and run 7 days in a row, otherwise you're going to get injured. So we had to build Michelle from not very much run volume at all, maybe 10 to 15 miles a week at the start, up to, in the end, she was up to about 60 to 70 miles a week. And we would have loved more, but that's a great growth. I mean, I'm so proud of her. That's an amazing growth in about a 6 to 7 month period from very little running to really serious marathon training. And of course, it's the ability to recover. So thinking about recovery, there's lots of basics you can do there. Obviously, we're going to talk about supplementation, I mentioned. We're going to talk about active things like modalities, the massage, the Normatec boots, the ice baths, the sleep, all those things come into this as well. The most important thing was that was built into the training program. So every day wasn't a hard stimulus. If sometimes we would have a day that was a hike, so we could have time on feet without it being destructive and painful for running. And also the other thing, a lot of runners should do this. I'm a great believer, especially the triathlete who wants to do the great marathon. The cycling volume can make a huge difference aerobically to you, where you have time on the bike, building that aerobic base and all the enzymes and mitochondria you need to be a fat-burning athlete. Use that time to make yourself a better runner. So if we're going to talk about periodization just specifically for a second, I start with what I call an adaptation phase, which is just getting into training, getting into a rhythm of doing all the right things, which would be the running, the strength and conditioning, the core work, the flexibility, the mobility, the foam rolling, all those things that make up a training program. Getting into the habit of doing that, that's the adaptation phase. Then we go into conditioning, and conditioning is really about getting a little bit more volume in there, very little intensity, but building that fat burning base based on the lab data and seeing how far we can get with just increasing volume without any intensity. So the conditioning phase, we call it base, I call it advanced conditioning. And once we've done that, and that can be a big block of maybe 12 weeks, then we go to the strength phase. And the strength phase is just adding a little bit more resistance work in the gym to get really strong, and also starting to use hills to add a little bit more resistance, if you like, to run training. After that, we're into the speed phase, where we're focusing more on threshold work, tempo work, adding some of that in. Still very, very aerobic, still some fat being burnt when you're doing threshold and tempo work. And after that, if we've got all the gains from those blocks of training, then we're going to look at true speed, VO2 max development, speed, power, so that's your reps on the track, that's your 16 times 400s or whatever it is you want to do that's top end super fast work. And I want to just state this for the record is a lot of people hear about we need to develop our VO2 max. And yes, you want your VO2 max to be optimized, but you don't develop VO2 max by doing VO2 max high intensity training all the time. You often can't reach or express your true VO2 max because your body can't burn fats, or because you have no base, or you have poor biomechanics. So yes, we want to develop VO2 max, but we need our ligaments, our tendons, the physiology of us generally to be great before we do the icing on the cake. So it is still totally true. Build an aerobic base, and the wider your base, the taller the pyramid. It's totally true. The speed at the peak is dependent on how big that base is. So you want to build the aerobic base and then stack all the correct training in order to hit that true peak come race day. So of course, training for 7 marathons in 7 days requires being on your feet 7 days in a row. You can't get away from that. But you can't just jump straight into that, as I've said before. You've got to build up to it. So Michelle did build up to basically 7 half marathons in 7 days, which was super impressive to be able to even do that. But the other thing we did a lot of before, instead of just running every day, would be a run followed by a long hike. So it was time on feet, getting used to just lacing up, getting out there, being on your feet when you were tired. And then actually, because she couldn't handle quite as much volume as everybody else, because she hadn't got the running background, the years of running, what we did was increase the intensity at times. So she still did VO2 intervals, threshold training every single week, in this build to the Great World Race. So of course there's run training, right, where you have the changing stimulus of volume, frequency and intensity, and we did all the training across all the different zones and changed that all the time. But then also periodizing the strength work to go from basic conditioning, where we're really focusing to start with on ligaments and tendons and basic balance and functional movement, and making sure the body is generally strong and able to handle training, to then adding load to that, becoming physically strong without gaining any size, and moving that into then power, to have some explosive strength, which is just another stimulus on the body to force another adaptation. And then going into the endurance style strength work to really make things sustainable for long periods of time. Lots of functional moves as well, lots of run specific moves, and lots of things to help the basic biomechanics. I think something really worth mentioning here is building confidence while you're training. It's not always about being able to hit the master plan. And in truth, often the training program that is written to start with is modified dramatically along the way. And that's actually a lot of my work as a coach and a consultant, is starting with a master plan that's built based on lab data and what the athlete says they can do with their daily life, and then modifying that as things come up. You've always got to have the flexibility to change your plan. And I think the key thing is to celebrate what you did, what you can do, rather than things you couldn't do. The greats have said this. I remember Mark Allen, the Ironman great, focused on what he did in the day rather than what he'd hoped to do and didn't manage to quite do. If you set out to run 20 miles and you do 18 of the 20, that's a good day, right? It's 18 miles in the bank. The 2 you missed, hey, you can make it up another day. And would those 2 miles really make that much difference? Probably not. The most important thing, consistency in training, being able to get up and do it over and over and over again, but also to enjoy that process and get a lot out of it mentally, as not just physically. So one of the things you should be checking in your training all the time is how you're absorbing your training, and are you actually training accurately? So I use Training Peaks. I love the software Training Peaks to be able to see the graphs of heart rate compared to pace. And what I'm looking for is, if I've given a zone 2 training day, that the heart rate was in zone 2, and then seeing what the pace response was. So obviously most of the time what we're looking for is that you're in zone 2 heart rate and we see zone 2 pace. As the athlete gets fitter, they're going to be zone 2 heart rate and the pace is going to start to get a little faster. That's showing an adaptation. Of course, when the athlete's fatigued, the paces are going to get a little bit slower. But what I don't want to see is those zone 2 heart rates creeping up into zone 3 and above when athletes are trying to chase pace in training. I'm a great believer in heart rate based training all the time. When we do threshold work and beyond, we do focus on pace, but heart rate is king. We want to know exactly what your body stress is under and see how you respond to that. So definitely looking at heart rates and tracking your response to that in training is number 1 for me. So of course, another part of training, and then we've talked about a little bit, is being specific not only to the course you're running, but the conditions you're going to be in. Not everybody does great in hot conditions, right? But this is going to have 6 very, very hot days, we believe. And so training for that's been key. And as I mentioned, Michelle has been living in Burbank and running in the heat in the middle of the day there. But we've also used things like sauna to really help push that heat adaptation. We've also used some overdressing to push that as well. And we also did a crazy thing one day where we took a treadmill into a heated yoga room. It was well over 110 degrees and crazy, crazy hot and humid. And we tested specifically sodium and water loss and heart rates at target race pace. And it was fascinating to see how much water and how much sodium people lose in those different conditions. So I would suggest to anybody training for these events, get yourself, I use actually, because it functions really well and connects to the Garmin watch, and you get a data field on your watch and you're seeing real-time sodium and water loss. I use the H-drop sensor. There are other sensors out there to use, but to me, because that's integrated with the watch and you can see in real time, it's great, right? You're seeing exactly what water's been lost, exactly what sodium, so you can change your fueling while you're doing the event. And we discovered for Michelle that in an hour, and she's about 125 pounds, she's a small lady, right? She was losing about 2 liters of water per hour, and she was losing about 2 grams of sodium. Without that sort of data, racing becomes a complete problem. So we had to focus on also training in the heat, getting used to it, and getting used to fueling the body with that much fluid and water. Another thing worth mentioning, of course, is your general health. And I'm going to touch on what we've done to deep dive into immune health and digestive health when we are traveling on this event. Because, of course, you know, running a marathon, getting on a plane and trying to recover at 36,000 feet is quite the challenge. So we've dived deep into that, and I'll talk more about that in another video. But in general, in training, health is key, right? There's no point in training when you're sick. I can't believe the number of people who tell me, oh yeah, I've got a cold, but I'm just going to train anyway. Or I'm on antibiotics for such and such, but I still did my run today. To me, that's just stupid. You can't absorb training. If your body's fighting to get you healthy, it's not going to absorb the training you're doing. So we had a little phase with Michelle where she got sick in the middle of the training. There's a little COVID bout going around, and so it was an obvious shutdown training. And what can we do then? Nothing but recover. And actually, if you think about it, when you're resting, you're recovering at a cellular level too. So sometimes I found, and this should give you confidence, I found athletes who sometimes have an enforced week off with a sickness or a cold or whatever. When they come back from that, they've absorbed all the training they did for months before, and they're actually now stronger, fresher legged, and they run and train so much better straight afterwards. So sometimes an enforced break is okay. If you're sick, rest, don't bother training. Treat it as active recovery. You're absorbing all the training you've done in the past. Okay, so that's the whole thing. I think training for the Great World Race, we've covered becoming a complete athlete. We've covered what it takes to specifically train for these marathons days upon days in a row. I'm open to any questions. If you've got a question, stick it in the comments down here or email me, cg@coachgareth.com. I'm happy to answer your questions. And if anything I've missed here, tell me and I'll put it in a video after this.
If you like what you see here, please hit the subscribe button below to be the first to know about new videos and free premium content.